I wanted to talk briefly about contrasting the current period with that of that I experienced back in the late 60s and early 70s here in Boston during the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement. In those days, in the late 60s and early 70s, we had full employment. So the economy really wasn't an issue in relation to the war. I mean, you could literally walk out of one factory if you didn't like it and go into another one and get another job during that period. Manufacturing was still very strong. You could get a factory job easily. Many of my friends did. And you could leave it the next day and go grab another one somewhere. So therefore, there wasn't an economic draft. They had to use a real draft. And that's, of course, a lot of the driving of the anti-war movement during that period was the fact of the real draft that opened the eyes of people like myself to what was going on in the world and what the role of our government's foreign policy was. Today, things are quite different. In this century, we have a permanent, basically, recession or depression for a lot of people, and that has only gotten worse in the last period. Jobs are being outsourced, factories, of course, but also white-collar jobs. You know, the kind of people who never expected to be unemployed or destitute or homeless or whatever are now in that situation. There's just an article about it in the New York Times this morning about, you know, people my age in their early 60s depending on their children to keep a roof over their heads. Now we also have an economic draft, as I'm sure you're familiar with, because of the economic situation, and a lot of these people who are involved in the economic draft to join the military come from places like upstate New York, you know, white guy pickup truck territory, small towns, because of the lack of opportunity in these rural areas. And of course, we also have, as a result of the rebellion against the draft during the Vietnam War, the huge use of mercenary forces, so-called contractors, in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Again, drawn pretty much from the same pool of the white guy pickup truck crowd in rural areas. During the Vietnam War, Vietnam was presented as a domino in the communist conspiracy to take over the world. The fear was ideological, not that, basically that you would be turned into some kind of a zombie. And we all remember, you know, the pod people movies and things like that played on that fear. Today, Afghanistan and Iraq have been presented entirely, again, fear is the driver. That hasn't changed between Obama and Bush. So therefore, given the change in the situation and the discussion we're having around the economic crisis, that, in terms of talking to working people, which is what I do on a daily basis on my job in the labor movement, we have to figure out how to bring out the question of the economic crisis so that as a wedge against this fear, because the reality is you're a lot more likely to lose your job and be homeless and suffer some kind of even physical harm as a result of the economy than you are to be blown up by a terrorist somewhere. Lately in upstate New York, both in my industry, the railroad industry, where there's been massive layoffs, and in the local economy, which is dominated in the capital region of New York by the state workers who are now in an unfolding economic crisis similar to that of California. And more specifically, a situation that has recently developed, a very interesting situation where a factory just north of Troy, which used to be owned by GE but was spun off to a private equity firm, they unilaterally, during the middle of a contract, slashed the production workers' pay from 25 to 50%. A friend of mine who has worked there for more than 20 years had her pay cut from $29 an hour to $19 an hour. And these are white workers. These are your pickup truck people. And the response has been very interesting. They have suddenly come alive, and it's like Rip Van Winkle waking up and rubbing their eyes. You know, what's going on here? And their president and officers have joined the Troy Labor Council. The the resolution, I only have 20 copies, you can please share them, that we passed on a national labor march for jobs, peace, and healthcare justice was very much supported by these people. They had just joined the council last October. And it's really been something to see, a little glimpse of the most conservative group in the working classes, which is the predominantly white male workforce, waking up a little bit.
70s and 80s. First of all, it's important to know industry in New England, in the Northeast, and especially the unionized industry has always been heavily involved in military production.
Right.
And back in the 70s and 80s, we used to talk about conversion. You know, I worked, you know, that was an important component of what we did. And ironically, it happened. When I first went to work for GE, I worked on power plants, freighter ship engines, railroad gears, and when I got laid off at the end of the 1980s, it was Trident submarines, nuclear aircraft carriers, and I personally built the gears for the first Arleigh Burke DDG destroyer that the speaker from Maine talked about. And then I got laid off. And so since then, the unionized industrial workforce in New England is even more concentrated in military production than it used to be. And we have to have a kind of dialogue with those folks. If we want the labor movement to be part of the struggle for change, we have to figure out a way to talk in a constructive way with the local unions and unionized workers who work in those plants, like GE now, which is almost 100% military, and Raytheon and other places, which are the remnants of the unionized industrial working class in New England, is mostly military now.
You're not going to get the best response right off the bat from people employed in the military sector. But I mean, I'm in the machinist union. I work for the railroad industry, and we've suffered massive layoffs and are directly affected by any ups and downs in the economy. Those workers in those areas who are unionized are going to be more receptive initially, and you have to look at those workers as a connecting rod to the most diehard pro-military workers who will be ones employed in the military contracting, and it's a real problem in the AFL-CIO, particularly with a union like the Machinist Union that's so bifurcated by military contracting. I mean, the Machinist Union represents people in woodworking and passenger planes and everything else, but it also has a huge component. If you go to a Machinist Union convention, which I did back in 2000, you're going to see a video of jet fighters roaring across the landscape at the same time that they celebrate Ed Asner and William Wimpesinger. You know what I'm saying? Exactly. It's a contradiction. So in terms of approaching labor, it's going to be the public employees and the unions that are dominated by African Americans and Latinos are going to be the first to approach. And in industry, you got to go after those who are not directly employed by the military, who are being affected by military spending. The other thing about military spending, the way I look at it, is for the U.S. economy, it's a little bit like heroin. And that, at this point, World War III is not going to be like World War II, where all of a sudden there are huge armies sucking people out of the workforce. Women are going to work making welding airplanes together and aircraft carriers and destroyers. World War III is going to be a little bit different. It's going to probably involve nuclear weapons and millions of people getting killed. So you can't really make a case that, well, we need a third world war to get full employment. It's not going to happen. The junkie is, the veins are all flat, in this country. So that's my answer to people who say that, well, war is good for the economy. It's not.
Thank you.